Good morning. My name is Bryan, and I'm the director of the Urban Technology Program at the University of Michigan, which is our newest undergraduate degree at the Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning. We are very thankful for the pathway that's been blazed by Cornell Tech here, and also for the ecosystem that's been built by SCNY. This event today is an opportunity for us to think about the ecosystem and to think about a field, really, that's growing in urban tech. And we're very excited to talk about the questions of design, data, policy, and governance here on the panel. But first things first, let's welcome Stephen Larrick and Sarah Williams. So Stephen, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself and say a little bit about your work, and then we'll let the conversation flow.
Awesome. So hello, everyone. My name is Stephen Larrick. I'm an academic research fellow at the Belfer Center. I am under the title of Technology and Public Purpose Fellow. So Belfer is a think tank within Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. And I am studying the ways that digital platforms have changed power dynamics within cities and how cities are responding, specifically with new models of data governance. And so I see that as really relevant to today's theme of dark plans, and I'm really excited to talk about that. But in terms of introducing myself, I'd love to actually start with a little bit of my how I arrived at that research focus. I started my career in city government and in data advocacy. And in both of those worlds, transparency was really key to my work. So when I was in City Hall directing a planning department in a small New England mill city, publishing our budgets, our grant applications, publishing our zoning data, our parcel data for the first time, moves like this were really important to our theory of how we could rebuild trust after a previous administration's corruption, and how we could re-engage the public after disenfranchisement as a result of a fiscal receivership. And this was such a formative experience for me that I decided to focus on transparency full-time as an advocate at the Sunlight Foundation. And I worked with over 60 different city halls supporting open data programs and policies that could make, developing a theory of change through which greater access to information could power a more responsive local democracy. Somewhere along the way in the past 10 years, though, it became clear that the game had changed, and that this was an incomplete model. I think to our theme today, increasingly as with the rise of smart cities, with the attention that existing tech platforms have given to data generated by urban residents, there's a lot more information through which we can know and understand the city, which might seem good for transparency or for kind of an informed democracy. But it's, as a percentage of the total information, it's much more private. It's kind of behind the black box. And so, what does that mean for governance and how cities are responding? That was kind of something that started to catch my interest. And so after Sunlight, I started working in an urban technology company called Stay that was working to actually address this issue through a technical solution. The idea being, if we could empower a layer of data exchange through API management tools and the like, maybe cities in the private sector could work together, could share data. Maybe cities could kind of use data to inform decision making, to set new kinds of policy, et cetera. But really what I began to learn along the way is this is not purely a technical challenge. This is a challenge of politics and really of worldview and how we want to balance power allocation between public and private institutions, and how we balance institutional and democratic rights to know against individual rights to privacy. And so, I think being the messy political conversation that it is, I'm excited that we're kind of addressing this theme today in this kind of conversational context with two great panelists. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Great. I'm super excited to chat with you because these are a lot of the things that I've been thinking about in my recent book. Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Williams. I'm an associate professor of technology and urban planning at MIT, where I also direct the Leventhal Center for Advanced Urbanism and the Civic Data Design Lab. And my research interests really focus on how we can use data for policy action, and is the name of my most recent book, Data Action. I'll just take a moment to say that the Leventhal Center has three main interests. It's thinking about working with cities and investigating problems with them over a course of 5 or 6 years. And so we have something called our Cities Initiative. We have a focus on equitable resilience, and then we have a new focus on digital urbanism, which is really seeking to think about some of the things that we're talking about today. One is how do we use data for action? Another theme within that digital urbanism is civic technology and the development of civic tech. Climate intelligence is another kind of sub-theme with that, and then algorithms for practice. So really building, let's say, software that can help us build and kind of think of new ways to look at cities. But in my book, Data Action, I do talk a lot about open data, and I have a chapter on that. And obviously a lot of where open data comes from is this idea of transparency in government. But I also kind of wrote the book with the same curiosity that Jude had, in that with all of this data that we now have, did people know the ways that it could be misused or misrepresented, or ways in which we could inaccurately represent this information? And so Data Action really set out to create a corrective standard to practice to using open data sets, and hopefully guiding people in a way to use it to not create harm. That's something that I mention in the end of the book, called 7 Principles of Using Data for Policy Change. But my background comes from like a similar diversity in terms of I was a geographer, an urban planner, an architect, and really take the tools that I developed to kind of mash them up into creating a way to open data up through data visualizations, right? So there's one thing to open data up through its raw form, but there's another thing to make it accessible to more individuals. And I think communicating with data through visualizations is in a really important way that we can create the kind of transparency in government that we want to see.
Thank you. And we're going to dig a little bit more on some of the themes that both of you touched on. But I want to start by poking a little bit at the title of this panel, Dark Plans, which borrows its name from Dr. Townsend's impressive horizon scan. Urban tech provides so many reasons to be skeptical. Surveillance capitalism, algorithmic decision-making systems, plain old lazy applications of technology. Surprise, evil intent can be encoded in systems of all kinds, whether executed in Python or on paper, personal decisions, or platforms. What's new in the context of urban technology is that the systems many of you are building, researching, or attempting to govern are ones that are hard to think about because they evade very familiar dichotomies. For instance, as an architect, I'm fixated on questions of scale. When I start a new project, I think about how it fits in the hand if it's something designed for a human. And that implies the relationship between the thing and the body and the diversity of bodies. Whereas when designing a campus, those concerns are joined by questions of human experience in the aggregate. So small scale focuses on body, larger scale tends to be concerned with flows of humans, crowds, capital, power, environmental forces, et cetera. So then as a hypothetical here, consider a ride-hail service like Uber. Is it small or is it large? What's the scale of that thing? It provides convenience to the individual, but it's at the cost of increased congestion for the city. It's accessed on a phone that fits easily in your pocket, but it relies on a vast network of servers, drivers, et cetera. So simply put, is it small or is it large? Digital services, of course, don't abide by the scalar logic of the concrete world here outside the metaverse. Urban technologies are small and large at the same time. And as we saw during one of yesterday's panels, it takes the volt post and the community solar farm and the statewide energy plan to live in a green future. So the refusal of urban tech to comply with past dichotomies of scale is just one of the ways in which thinking through these issues is complicated. So surprise number 2, building a truly post-industrial society might require us to employ post-industrial ways of thinking, right, that don't match the kind of familiar past that we've entertained to date. So here's another dichotomy that I think we don't like, or I'll speak for myself, I don't like. If as a society we choose to embrace fast and frequent decisions made using abundant data, the eventuality of incorrect choices will become turbocharged and amplified, while conceptions of privacy and how we achieve it will evolve, perhaps painfully. On the other hand, resisting the intensification of urban data means telling future generations that they must continue to bear the inherent failures of our status quo. So from racist policing outcomes to physical infrastructure that we protect with, I don't know, thoughts and prayers, this is a challenge that we have to work through as a community of practice, right? Finding some navigation across that dilemma. So a world of dark plans requires that we straddle dichotomies, whether large and small, fast and slow, public and private, anonymous and identifiable. Between all of these false dichotomies, the question is not one or the other, but how. How we strike a balance. And that sounds like a question of governance. And that sounds like a question of design. So Stephen, you've described data and privacy as almost a proxy war for governance. And I'm wondering if you could help us both unpack that a little bit. And perhaps, Stephen, you could start by talking about the work you've done on data sharing mandates with cities.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't pretend my screen is frozen while I think this over anymore. Yeah, I think I'll start by setting the stage a little bit in terms of the context out of which I think some of the municipal responses to a datafied world have emerged. So, I think as we all have alluded to, whether it's IoT sensors, urban tech, smart city technology, or kind of existing platforms using cities as a place to kind of harvest increasingly more data, the stuff that we call surveillance capitalism has changed the game. There's a lot more data out there. And this has disrupted the traditional power dynamic in the city. It means that municipal officials who have traditionally thought of themselves either as the relevant authority, decision maker, source of truth, maybe no longer are in a clear, uncontested way. For instance, Waze is better able to route traffic and to than any Department of Public Works sign. Location data aggregators have better counts of people or vehicles than the latest consulting report that is sitting on an urban planner's shelf. And in some very real ways, when platforms make rules that govern people's behavior in urban space, it's a challenge to other kinds of the traditional governance model in a democratic city hall. And so all these things are kind of changing the game. And cities are responding in a few ways. And I think maybe before I get into the specifics of what I study, I'll describe a little bit of the difficult choice that I've seen a lot of public officials faced with. I think there is kind of this realization that, hey, there's a lot of data out there, maybe we could use it, but a paralysis that comes with hey, surveillance capitalism is bad, and maybe we shouldn't do that. So, I describe this as there's the head in the sand approach, We're going to pretend like this data isn't out there, and we'll continue to make decisions without it, or we'll continue to try to regulate without it. Or there's the kind of if you can't beat them, join them approach. And we've seen some cities kind of get overzealous and start demanding data or start replicating problematic surveillance approaches in an attempt to kind of vacuum up personal information. And so what I'm really looking at is the nuance of these different approaches, and is there a third way, or is there a way to balance those two extremes? And one of the places I'm examining that is in the realm of data sharing mandates. So increasingly, one of the things that we're seeing is city halls actually telling companies like Uber, hey, if you're going to operate here, there's a basic level of data that you're going to need to share with us. And without that data, this is really a black box that we can't tolerate, or if we're going to have a democratic street grid. For a long time, there were talking points about reducing congestion, reducing emissions, or there were assurances around, say, labor law compliance in terms of the length of a shift that a driver was taking. And I think New York has been an example of a place that has kind of looked at that and said, we actually need some level of information sharing. We need to put some sunlight on this dark pattern if we're going to effectively have this, what amounts to a public-private partnership of offering this service to the public on our streets, to actually take a look. Is it true that it's reducing traffic? Is it true that it's reducing emissions? Can we be sure that labor laws are being complied with? And so, I think the Taxi and Limousine Commission and the work that they made there is something that is part of a larger trend of saying, how do we work with tech platforms in a way that that involves some level of collaborative data governance? But this can be done well, and there are different ends of the spectrum, and I think we've seen this increasingly in the world of micromobility, where at the one end of the spectrum you have cities like Los Angeles that are requesting any and everything in terms of the data, and for wide variety of use cases that are maybe defined maybe a little bit broadly. And on the other end of the spectrum you have cities like Austin, Texas, where they don't even want to hold trip data. They just want origins and destinations that are fuzzed, and they have really strict policies around seeing this data as something that could potentially be a risk to personal rights to privacy. And again, I don't think this is just about data. This is about a broader conversation of who, digital services require storing and working with and collecting data. Are these services public services? Are they purely private? To what extent are they democratically accountable? Those are the larger questions here. And so my goal is that by studying these emerging governance structures for data, it will actually say something about that broader conversations we're having about democratic accountability.
If only there was somebody who had written a book with 7 points of conscientious data use. Who might that be?
Yeah, no, this is a really interesting question. It's something I talk about in the last chapter of my book, and the growing dominance of Google and Facebook having way more data than cities. Like, it used to be governments had more data. Now Facebook and Google, and in many places that I work, it's the only data that exists, right? Like in Nairobi and some other, just in Sierra Leone, like the only data that exists is from Google. And I think that it's really important that we think of data as a piece of infrastructure very similar to electricity, because it does, I'm not trying to get like it's the new oil. I hate that. I hate that. But more that it needs to start thinking about regulations in the same way that we regulate electricity companies, water companies, and that there is this kind of private partnership with governance in order to, let's say, remain the public good in which this data potentially has to offer, while also allowing the private companies who own this data to kind of retain some control. I think we have missed the boat on the Ubers and the Waze, but we haven't, and and the work that you're doing is actually trying to help fix that and resolve some of those issues. But I think even more need to be thinking about it as autonomous vehicles come onto the roadways. And what I'm seeing right now is as we put autonomous vehicles on the road, we are just deregulating everything around them in order for that innovation to happen. But I also think the potential of the data that autonomous vehicles have is significant, but the potential losses to cities are significant, whether it's loss in money to parking or loss in other kinds of like tolls and funds that they get, taxes that come through, let's say, autonomous taxi vehicles. And so those kind of potential losses need to be weighed with also the data. And it's right now that we need to start those data sharing agreements. And if cities kind of miss the boat again, we have not just significant losses in like thinking about privacy issues, but just losses in city funds in general. Like some cities, half of their money comes from parking tickets, transportation tickets. So this is a big deal. And so that's where I do feel like it's this public-private partnership in which we can work towards a new data governance structure. And I think that we can look to kind of electricity companies to help us think about that. But obviously it's going to need to change because the kind of infrastructure we're dealing is infrastructure which includes all of us inside of it, right?
Yeah.
And that remembering that data really at the heart of it is also people. And so when you're thinking of it collectively, you need to think about what is the potential to harm people within that data set.
So I want to come back to this question of risks and tease that one out a little bit. But before we go there, I'm struck by your comparison to utilities as perhaps a governing metaphor for us to think about here. One of the differences, though, is that the types of systems that we're building now involve not just data, but also algorithmic actions that are being taken. And so the darkness in the Dark Plans title is about the opacity of our inability to fully understand those systems. So how do you think that changes the metaphor of looking to perhaps the way that we've thought about utilities in the past and then trying to transfer some of those learnings to today?
Right. I mean, utilities also have their dark plans. So obviously they're not, I would say, the gold star standard that we should be looking towards. But what I'm more speaking to is this kind of the way that government does get involved with a private company. But as we know, even with electricity and other infrastructure, there are also, let's say, things that are obfuscated, hidden. And I would say in our case, one of the things that we really need to be doing is really doing a critique of what potential harms can be done with the data. And I think this is really hard to do. And I think what's interesting is, like recently all of the scandal of Facebook, right? They actually did internal critique, right? But then they didn't apply it. And so I think that that is where, we would have to make in this new kind of public-private partnership, ensuring that there's critique of our algorithm, but also then taking action with that critique.
One way that I think something that you're getting at is how do we even define the problem space to have the right conversation? And I think to your point about some of these things being larger than the human scale are hard to conceive of or fully wrap our minds around. And to your point about some of these emerging technologies that aren't as well understood, like autonomous vehicles, zooming in from the macro philosophical scale to the human scale, some of the conversations I've had with private companies and public agencies have been really illuminating just in terms of both the overlap and the gaps in understanding. I worked with on a research project that involved an AV pilot with an AV company and a DOT. And one of the things we saw was there just wasn't a clear understanding. The whole purpose of this project was ostensibly to research this new technology. through use of data generated by sensors on this vehicle that is collecting an unprecedented amount of information as it traverses the city street grid. But there wasn't really a clear understanding of what information is being collected by this LiDAR scan? How is it being structured? What can we even ask for? And significantly less information than I think the DOT and the research team certainly wanted to be able to look at was shared. And I think there was some of this certainly was related to concerns around proprietary business information or around certainly wanting some things to remain private for whatever reasons. But some of this was just the basics of not speaking the same language and not necessarily even knowing what to ask for. And so I think there's a lot that can be done with not necessarily even looking at the thing itself, but with metadata, with understanding what are the assumptions that go into an algorithm. And so I think in terms of tangible starting points that can help us move in that direction that Sarah's describing, that's one area where I see a big need, is the ability to translate these complex data structures into something understandable for not just the public officials who are overseeing a new technology, but for the broader public to kind of have that conversation. So that's certainly one place where I would like to see more emphasis is metadata. It's not necessarily something that we always think about, but yeah.
I mean, I think this brings up something, Sarah, that's so strong in your work, is that transparency on its own is not enough, right? We need actually legibility of these systems to really be able to grapple with them.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, I think what's interesting about what you're saying is, right, I was just on a talk with Daniela Russ that uses the LiDAR data to actually, program the cars, and she was talking about the amount of information they need just to have the car sense a person on the road or sense different things. So there's still, and I think that's where the private companies are at, just listening to her talk. I'm they're at, I need all this data to figure out the technology to move the car around the corner. And that's their business right now, and they don't want to give up that data because they're using it to make that. And if they can get the car to turn faster or more accurately, they're going to be better in the field. So I think it's absolutely right. Businesses don't see the benefit of sharing the data at all. They only see a risk, potential risk. And I think that's exactly where academia should fall, right? Is helping kind of be a translator between the private company's objectives are their business model, and they should be, right? And giving them opportunity to see, how that data can be good. Governments on the other side benefit from not owning all this data, right? In fact, not having any of the legal ramifications on it. It's great that it's owned by these private companies, and helping them move to a model where they can see the benefit of having some of that data shared. But in that space in between, there's so much work translating what those data needs are, thinking about algorithms that actually create privacy. And I'm on this differential privacy group at MIT. It's so hard to ever say something is truly anonymized, right? So we have work in that space. And then we have work around just the regulations of privacy within that space. So I think there's just a lot of work to be done, but I'm hopeful that we can do that before the autonomous vehicles get on the roadways, and I would want to, because I think, they create a whole world every second, and they're recreating that whole world every second, and that's going to be tapped into for all kinds of business agendas. And if we don't start thinking about it now, we're going to miss out on how government can be involved in creating it equitably. Because I think without some form of public involvement, the equity issues are going to be huge.
Yeah, and I think one thing you're reminding me of is, the company we were working with, that they were talking on the level of the semantic map, and they had a very clear use case: how can this vehicle drive itself? And I think one of the few areas where there was an ability to kind of see that value was when a use case was really clearly defined.
Yeah.
And so I think sometimes you have a government saying, hey, give us your data. And then there's that concern that you were describing earlier from the private company. But if we say, hey, we really need to ensure, we want to better understand where this vehicle isn't operating well so that we can inform our next round of infrastructure improvements that could maybe help support this type of technology. That's a different conversation. Or if we want to actually be able to inform the permitting body so that they can know how they could actually give this permission to run on beyond a pilot basis. That's a different type of use case. And as soon as we started talking about the specifics of those types of things, there were, I think, two things happened. One thing was it becomes a problem that you can solve together. And the other is that I think, for some of these systems, it's a big, complex data structure, and even just sharing it it's not hard. It can be a lot of work.
Yeah.
And so when you don't have someone on staff who is in charge of kind of translating something that's built for a very specific application to that other government need of oversight, you're concerned that if you just share that big, messy thing, it's going to be misused. And that's not actually, that's not always a, hey, I want to protect what's mine. Sometimes that's a, I don't want harm to come from this data.
Yeah.
And so I think, again, defining not only the metadata or kind of like the unknown unknowns of what is the structure, what are the assumptions that go into it, what are the fields, but also what are the specifics of why it's needed. I think that starts to give you something a little bit more tangible to kind of bring these two parties together.
I think that's such an important question, though, that you're just mentioning, is this understanding the specifics of the questions, I think goes beyond just the autonomous. It goes for everything that we're doing with data in society, right? And I see this at MIT all the time. We have groups of statisticians and people who are doing machine learning. They don't know the right questions to ask. They need our help. And I think the more that we team up together, those of us that understand the kind of social issues, the city issues, with people who do really want to do good in the world, we can help generate some of those questions. And it's really through those partnerships that we can do them.
So let me ask then, there's a question that came in the Zoom chat. And by the way, if there are questions here, we'll get to those in a minute. So think about it now. The question is basically, is the kind of conflict over MDS, the data standard that LA has employed for mobility data, whether it will be precedent setting. So I want to ask both of your thoughts on that as a specific example, but then also, to what extent are real conflicts like that, as difficult as they might be, generative in that they allow us to really flesh out things in a specific context, right? So what do you think about the MDS issue at the moment? This is the subject of giant Twitter battles at the moment. So I'm sorry for putting you on the spot.
That's such a large, I don't think I'm going to solve MDS right now. So what is the specific question?
Well, first of all, do you see a conflict or an issue like MDS in Los Angeles being precedent setting, I guess is the question.
Yeah. I do think another aspect of what I study are kind of how emerging ideas spread from city to city. And one thing that's really interesting is that in the absence of a precedent, when a place like Los Angeles, a big influential city like Los Angeles, takes a very clear stance on a thing and defines a data standard, it's going to have visibility to a lot of other cities. And when micromobility first hit the scene, I started tracking where are all the places where these operators are where these vehicle fleets are being deployed. Which of those places are requiring a permit? Which of those permits require some sort of data sharing? And at first there was a real hodgepodge of, hey, give us a monthly report in a CSV. Share, some high-level information. Some folks were citing GBFS, which had been a previous standard that's quite different from MDS in terms of just tracking vehicle availability rather than actual trips. And you did kind of quickly see a convergence around something else. And I think my research just started last month. I feel like I'm doing that academic thing of hedging, but that question is really what I'm looking to explore. I think the debate is productive. To me, the debate is one of the best things that's come out of MDS. But also, I should say that I have worked with MDS data and in places that aren't Los Angeles. And I do think sometimes too much of the conversation is focused on one city.
Yeah.
In Louisville, Kentucky, which is the slide right now, they had 2 use cases. And again, I think this idea of like what's the specific use case is critical. They wanted to ensure that West Louisville has historically been a community that has been lower socioeconomically and has had a higher African American population. And there were concerns that with this new form of mobility might exacerbate existing disparities in terms of access to mobility and freedom of mobility within the city. I think quite an admirable goal that the city had, the metro government had, was to make sure that 20% of their fleet went to West Louisville neighborhoods. And there's an MDS, for those unaware, is the mobility data specification. There's a feed that comes out of MDS that allows you to track when and where a vehicle is dropped off. And so they started using this feed for tracking how different operators like Bird and Lime and Spin were doing in terms of the percentage of their vehicle drop-offs that were in these drop-offs and rebalances that were in these designated equity zones. And to me, that is a very clear use case for which this data standard is useful. Another example is Louisville has a school for the blind, and there were great concerns about scooters being left on the, in my kind of urban planning background. There was a lot of fear-mongering around scooters and scooters being left on sidewalks. But I think one legitimate use case for needing to keep track of that is something like a school for the blind, which they had in Louisville, where obviously that's going to cause an issue for a vulnerable community. And so the metro government was interested in creating a geofence around that school for the blind and making sure they were tracking how different companies were doing, addressing issues where those vehicles were being left there. And so to me, that was 2 clear success stories of use of this standard, but it doesn't mean the whole worldview that the standard implies is kind of settled precedent. And so I think that's where I'm at right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think the MDS serves as a great case study. So as you said earlier, and it's actually one that we are using at MIT for. We have a new ethical computing as part of the college, and using this as an example of something that happened, right? Very like kind of privacy breach, and then how are we trying to overcome that privacy breach, and what are the ways to do that, as it very much is still, I think, developing. I think one thing that's come out of it is a lot more awareness about the ethics involved with micromobility data that maybe previously wasn't there. And then also a number of different tools that try to address it specifically. So there is like a privacy toolkit that we're looking at. And I started to look at all of these, because we're doing this case study right now, and I was like starting to look at all the toolkits. They're still missing a number of the issues that are important when we think about privacy and this kind of data, the ability to re-identify individuals. But I do think it's spawning companies and products that are trying to then aggregate the data and make it, let's say, more ethical. And I think that is really a lot of the potential good coming out from it.
Yeah, it is. It's such a polarizing topic right now. You talk to some people, and MDS is ushering in and wittingly or unwittingly building the infrastructure of the big brother police state, and you talk to others, and it is a needed oversight on tech power, and it's kind of restoring democratic accountability where it hasn't been, or it's kind of a new innovative model for public-private partnership. And it can be kind of a Rorschach test. And I think, as with a lot of the things we're talking about, a lot of the devil is in the details of okay, some places are using, different jurisdictions are using MDS in different ways. Like I said, Austin is in some ways using MDS, but in a very different way from how LA is using MDS. And so again, what are the use cases? How is that data being stored? Who has access to it? Is this real time? Is there a delay? These are all relevant questions, and that's why I think instead of blurting out a clear answer of what I think it all means, my goal is to study how this is playing out in dozens of US cities. I think there are 130 or so cities globally that have adopted MDS. Each of them does it a little bit differently, and it's so new that I'm looking to better understand it.
So with the academic hedge, we'll give you the pass on this one, but next time we expect the full report.
Yeah, come back to me in a few months.
Sarah's book already has the 7 points of data action. Are there any questions here? I think we have time for one question, if there is a question. A brief question, I believe.
So as America grew, it was often viewed that states were laboratories of living differently, and certainly our states have personalities, our cities have personalities. So it strikes me, I'll frame it as a question. Would it be worthwhile to allow in this period of learning cities to have sort of personalities of how they handle data so that we see what works and doesn't work, and it becomes kind of a competitive garden of ideas and behavior, and maybe 10 years from now we identify 3 big models or whatever, but it's early to be prescriptive because we don't really know where all this leads. Call that a question.
Yeah.
I feel like cities are already doing that. Cities are their own personalities, and I would say there's cities that have more open data, there are cities that are more closed. I think it runs the gamut. So there is that experimental space going on right now. I mean, when I think about Virginia and the total deregulation of autonomous vehicles, the states are also having their own character in this matter as well.
Yeah, I think there are layers to this. Certainly, state enabling legislation is one. So I think what you're describing, that's exactly my hope, is that we can learn something from the different approaches places are taking. I do hope that we can learn something a little faster. And I think part of what's tricky about what you're describing is, I think we're telling cities to do something really tricky. There's this brave new world of surveillance capitalism and the trove of urban data it's generated. And figure out how to do this, do something good with this, or but also don't don't screw up. Make sure that you're not harming vulnerable communities while you do it. And so do this thing you've never done before, but don't screw up. And so I think where there has been success, I think we really need to do a better job of kind of surfacing those case studies and amplifying them so that other places can learn from it. A lot of times the learnings are atomized and siloed, and it takes us too long to kind of circle the wagons around what's working. And I think...
And cities are all unique snowflakes, right? So it's very hard to translate from one to the other. So we hear again and again when you work with cities.
Yeah, and technology is moving so quickly that we need the city learnings to move quickly as well.
Yeah. So I think in answer to the question, the garden is here. Enjoy it. And with that, thank you so much.
Thank you.